When Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis on March 13, 2013, the world didn't realize it had just elected a man who would not only challenge the traditions of the Catholic Church, but reimagine what it means to be a spiritual leader in the 21st century. Born in Buenos Aires to Italian immigrants, he was the first Latin American pope, the first Jesuit pope, and the first pope to take the name Francis in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi, the humble reformer who renounced wealth to serve the poor. From the moment he appeared on the balcony overlooking St. Peter's Square and greeted the world with a simple "Buonasera," Pope Francis set a tone that shocked even his closest advisors. He refused to wear the traditional red papal cape, declined the gold cross, and rejected the luxurious apostolic palace for a modest room in Casa Santa Marta. This wasn't staged humility. It was real. It was uncomfortable. And it was exactly what the Church needed. In a time when many viewed the Church as rigid, distant, and obsessed with rules, Pope Francis brought it down to earth. He didn't speak like a theologian trapped in ivory towers. He spoke like a grandfather who knew the world was broken and wanted to help fix it. He called for mercy before judgment, compassion over condemnation, and dialogue instead of division. Critics said he was too informal. Traditionalists called him dangerous. But to the rest of the world, especially the marginalized, the forgotten, and the disillusioned, he was a revolution in white robes. He wasn't trying to impress church historians. He was trying to wake up the faithful. And in doing so, he may have sparked one of the most unexpected and profound spiritual revivals in modern history. Pope Francis didn't lead from a throne. He led from the fringes. From day one, he made it crystal clear. The Church must not be a fortress for the righteous, but a field hospital for the wounded. And so, he focused his papacy not on doctrinal debates, but on the real, raw suffering of the modern world. He washed the feet of prisoners and refugees. He embraced people with disfiguring illnesses in front of the cameras. He visited slums and spoke not about rules, but about hope. And perhaps most importantly, he constantly challenged both church and society to ask a simple but revolutionary question: what have you done for the least among you? Francis's deep concern for the poor wasn't political, it was gospel. He once said, "You pray for the hungry, then you feed them. That's how prayer works." And he practiced what he preached. He opened Vatican showers for the homeless. He installed a barber shop in St. Peter's Square. He even personally arranged shelter and care for migrants who had been ignored by global powers. But it wasn't just the poor he defended, it was the planet. His landmark encyclical Laudato Si was a direct challenge to world leaders, corporations, and indifferent consumers. He declared that environmental care is not optional. It is a moral obligation. He was the first pope to tie climate change directly to sin. The earth, our common home, is crying out, and his words echoed across every continent. He also broke silence on long taboo topics, not to erase doctrine, but to inject it with compassion. He reached out to the LGBTQ+ community, famously saying, "Who am I to judge?" Not as an endorsement of sin, but as a reminder that God's mercy comes before man's judgment. He demanded justice for victims of abuse, criticized systems of greed, and told the wealthy elite, "You cannot serve both God and money." He said it at global summits, to heads of state, to billionaires, to bishops. He didn't need armies. He had truth, and he wielded it with mercy. In a time when the world was fractured by politics, religion, and fear, Pope Francis refused to build higher walls. Instead, he built bridges, and not symbolic ones, real, meaningful, global connections between people who had long stood on opposite sides of faith, power, and history. Francis was not afraid of sitting with the other. He visited mosques, embraced imams, and even signed a historic document on human fraternity with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, a move that sent shockwaves through both the Islamic world and the Catholic Church. He wasn't trying to erase differences. He was trying to prove something bigger. That love is the only language heaven understands. He reached out to the Jewish community with warmth and honesty. He sat with Buddhists, Hindus, and atheists, not to convert with force, but to dialogue with respect. Because Pope Francis understood something timeless. You cannot lead souls you won't listen to. He also became a moral compass on the world stage, not just to Catholics, but to presidents, dictators, and common people alike. When he spoke, rooms went silent. When he wrote, governments took notice. And when he traveled, whether to war zones or refugee camps, he carried no crown, no sword, only a message. Peace is not negotiated by power. It is built by mercy. He famously went to Myanmar to speak for persecuted Rohingya Muslims. He visited the Holy Land and wept at the wall separating Israel and Palestine. He stood in silence at Auschwitz. These weren't public relations stunts. They were soulful statements that said, "I am with the suffering, no matter their faith or flag." Even when criticized, and he was heavily, Francis stayed firm. He knew traditionalists would accuse him of watering down doctrine, but he always clarified, doctrine is not weakened by mercy. It is fulfilled by it. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to be faithful. And in doing so, he modeled a kind of leadership the modern church hadn't seen in centuries. On April 21st, 2025, Easter Monday, Pope Francis passed from this world, closing the book on one of the most transformative pontificates in modern history. And now, as Catholics around the globe mourn, the question echoes through churches, headlines, and hearts. Was he the greatest pope of all time? He didn't perform grand miracles. He didn't write volumes of dense theology. What he did was far more radical. He made the papacy human again. He brought it back to its roots, not as a throne of power, but as a seat of service. Like Christ washing the feet of his disciples, Francis lived to remind us that greatness in God's kingdom is measured by how low you're willing to kneel. He redefined what it means to be pope in an era of division, distrust, and despair. He reminded the world that leadership without love is tyranny, and that orthodoxy without mercy is cruelty. And most of all, he reminded Catholics that holiness doesn't mean being perfect. It means being available to love. He was the Pope who called strangers, the Pope who made confessions in public, the Pope who turned global attention to the homeless man sleeping on the steps of a cathedral, to the migrant child drifting across a sea, to the addict no one else saw. He said, "The church must go out into the streets," and then he led the way. Even in death, he broke tradition, requesting to be buried in the Basilica of St. Mary Major instead of the Vatican tombs. No marble, no monuments, just the Mother of God and his rosary. Because for Pope Francis, the real legacy of a Christian life is not in how high you climb, but in how much you lift others along the way. Whether history crowns him the greatest pope ever is irrelevant to him now. But for a church yearning for tenderness, truth, and transformation, his impact is indelible. And perhaps that's the mark of greatness. Not in titles or timelines, but in the number of hearts that beat stronger because you loved them well. Pope Francis lived as if Jesus meant every word he said, and that alone might be what makes him unforgettable.